At the height of early 2000s fame, Lindsay Lohan didn't just have hits. She had momentum. Red carpets, screaming fans, magazine covers stacked week after week. Then the image cracked. Not with one shocking moment, but with a slow, relentless shift that turned paparazzi flashes into police lights and premieres into court dates. This timeline is addictive because it feels impossible until it isn't. How does someone go from being Hollywood's safest bet to a headline that signals risk? How does the same system that lifts a teen star so quickly become the one that steps back when the story gets messy? The internet remembers the mugshots and the rehab rumors, but that's not where the collapse starts. It starts earlier, off camera, where pressure builds quietly, and the rules are written by people who don't have to live inside them. Here's the uncomfortable truth. Lindsay's fall wasn't a single scandal you can point to and say, that's it. It was a sequence, a chain reaction. Fame arrived early, the spotlight never dimmed, and the margin for error disappeared before adulthood even had time to begin. Every night out became content, every stumble became a narrative, and once a narrative sticks, it doesn't need facts to keep moving. It needs repetition. So ask the question most timelines avoid. When did Hollywood decide she was no longer worth protecting? Was it the arrests or the reputation? The choices or the way those choices were framed? And if the same story unfolded today in a different media climate, would the ending be the same? To answer that, we have to rewind, past the headlines, to the setup that made the crash possible. Before Lindsay Lohan became a tabloid character, before the court dates, the late-night paparazzi shots, the what happened to her, think pieces, she was a kid in an industry that rewards you for being camera-ready long before it teaches you how to be stable. And that's the part people forget when they reduce her story to bad choices. Because when your childhood is public-facing, adulthood doesn't arrive like a normal transition. It arrives like a pressure test. Lindsay's early setup was classic child performer math. The earlier you start working, the earlier you learn that attention is a paycheck. You learn quickly how to deliver a smile on command, how to sound confident in interviews, how to look fine, even when you're tired. And if you're good, really good, the system accelerates you. More auditions, more sets, more expectations, more people around you with plans for your future. When the world is invested in your image becomes your job. This is where the off-camera story begins to matter. Because the public sees the polished version, the bright, lovable teen star, the charming interviews, the carefully framed rise. But behind that is a quieter truth. Young fame is a strange kind of isolation. Your peers aren't co-workers. Adults are. Your schedule doesn't match school life. Your mistakes don't stay private. And the more successful you become, the harder it is to step away, because stepping away feels like failing everyone who built their hopes around you. The early years also build a habit that later becomes dangerous, performing resilience instead of processing stress. In Hollywood, being strong often means not slowing down. It means showing up no matter what. It means laughing it off, doing the next interview, keeping the machine running. If you learn that early, you don't automatically learn the skills that protect you later: boundaries, stability, quiet routines, real privacy. Instead, you learn the skills that make you employable: charm, speed, adaptability, and the ability to look okay under pressure. So when Lindsay hits her peak, it doesn't happen in a vacuum. It happens on top of years of acceleration. The groundwork is already there. A life built around being watched, being wanted, being judged, before you've even fully decided who you are. And when that kind of life meets the chaos of early 2000s celebrity culture, the next chapter becomes almost inevitable. Because once the spotlight is permanent, the smallest cracks don't stay small. They get magnified into a storyline. Lindsay Lohan's peak wasn't just popular, it was inescapable. This is the era where she wasn't simply an actress. She was a cultural fixture, the type of celebrity who didn't need to do something new to be talked about, because her name alone was already content. Red carpets, talk shows, award season appearances, glossy magazine covers. She moved through a fame machine that ran at full speed and demanded she keep up. And here's the off-camera problem with a peak like that. It doesn't feel like winning. It feels like sprinting with no finish line, because peak fame comes with a hidden rule. You must stay visible to stay valuable. So the schedule stays tight. The events stay constant, and the pressure to look effortless becomes non-stop. The public sees the glow. The industry sees the product. Meanwhile, the person inside the spotlight is trying to function like an adult while still being treated like a headline. This is also when the paparazzi culture of that time becomes its own character in the story. Cameras didn't just follow celebrities, they hunted them. Night outings, restaurant entrances, car doors, sidewalks. Everything became a stage with flashbulbs. Privacy wasn't just rare, it was practically a luxury item. And when you're being photographed constantly, you stop living for yourself and start living for the next frame. You become hyper-aware of how you look, how you walk, who you're seen with, what it will mean tomorrow morning on a website or tabloid cover. At the peak, Lindsay's image still had that Hollywood darling shine. But the conditions around her were turning toxic. Because a peak like this creates a paradox. The more famous you get, the more people project onto you. Some expect perfection. Some crave a downfall. Some treat you like a character they can rewrite. And once the public starts craving the messy version, the media ecosystem begins nudging the story in that direction. Not always with lies, sometimes just with selective framing. A tired face becomes troubled. A night out becomes spiraling. A rumor becomes confirmed because enough people repeat it. So this era isn't just the top of her career arc. It's the moment the trap closes. The spotlight gets brighter, the scrutiny gets harsher, and the culture starts shifting from celebrating her to watching her, waiting to see what breaks first. And that leads directly into the next part, the phase where the nightlife narrative forms and the out-of-control label begins to stick. Because once the media ecosystem decides you're a nightlife headline, it doesn't take much to feed it. Just one photo, one blurry clip, one late-night exit framed like a crime scene. This era is important because it's the moment the label forms, not a fact. A label. The party girl storyline. The idea that she was out too much, reckless, spiraling, unpredictable. And even when there were normal, harmless nights that didn't mean anything, the cameras didn't care. The coverage didn't care. The story needed a direction, and the direction was chaos. The paparazzi footage from that time often tells the same visual sentence. Flashes, cars, crowds yelling, an exhausted face caught mid-step. It's the kind of environment that can make anyone look worse than they feel, especially someone young, under pressure, and trapped in a loop of being photographed every time they try to leave a building. The irony is brutal. The more attention you get, the harder it becomes to make healthy choices, because every attempt at normal life becomes a spectacle. And here's the off-camera twist. Nightlife wasn't just fun. In that culture, nightlife was also networking, image maintenance, social status, and proof you were still relevant. Being seen was part of the job, but being seen too much became the evidence used against you. So Lindsay was stuck in a double bind. Visibility kept her hot, but visibility also built the case that she was losing control. This is also when tabloid language becomes a weapon. Headlines start using the same repeated cues. Wild, troubled, out late again, concern, sources say, friends worried. The more that language repeats, the more the public stops asking what's true and starts believing the vibe. And once the vibe becomes a brand, it follows you into casting rooms, meetings, contracts. Suddenly the question isn't, is she talented? It's, is she reliable? So by the end of this part, the story has shifted. She's no longer being covered for projects. She's being covered for behavior. And that shift is a career earthquake, because behavior headlines don't fade when your next film comes out. They often outlast it. Which is why Part 5 hits like a hammer. Because once the nightlife narrative is established, the legal timeline doesn't land as a surprise. It lands like confirmation. This is the chapter where the story stops feeling like tabloid noise and starts looking like a timeline with real stakes. Because once legal trouble enters the frame, the public doesn't just watch for messy photos, they watch for outcomes. And for Lindsay Lohan, the late 2000s era became a loop. Incident, arrest headlines, court, probation terms, violation rumors, rehab, repeat. Even when the details changed, the pattern stayed recognizable enough that the public began treating it like a single narrative. She's spiraling. When early arrests and charges started appearing in the news cycle, it reframed everything that came before. The nightlife footage was no longer wild celebrity behavior. It became warning signs. And the brutal part about a first legal headline is that it changes how every future story is read. From that moment on, a late-night photo doesn't look like a party. It looks like a symptom. The media's tone hardens. The public begins collecting before-after comparisons, and the industry starts quietly calculating risk. Court dates became their own kind of stage, one Lindsay never asked for but couldn't avoid. Cameras outside courthouse doors, outfits analyzed like premieres, facial expressions turned into commentary. The same machinery that once sold her as a teen icon now sold her as a cautionary tale. And the more court appearances entered the public routine, the more her identity got replaced by a label: troubled. This is also where the damage becomes invisible but permanent. You can't outact a court storyline. You can't release a good performance and erase a legal headline. The court timeline sits on top of everything like a watermark. Probation is where the celebrity narrative usually turns into a pressure cooker. Because it's not only about what happened, it's about what happens next. Now every update becomes, did she comply? Did she miss something? Was there a violation? Is she taking it seriously? The public begins following the story like a series, waiting for the next episode, and every small detail becomes magnified into proof of progress or proof of failure. And this is where a young celebrity can get trapped in a psychological corner. Even if you try to do better, the public doesn't reward quiet improvement as loudly as it rewards a new collapse. Silence reads as secrecy. One misstep reads as a pattern. And the pattern becomes the only thing people remember. Rehab should be private. In this era, it became public material. The culture treated rehab entries like press releases, counting them, comparing them, turning a personal crisis into a scoreboard. And regardless of what was actually happening off camera, whether she was seeking help, being pressured, trying to stabilize, rehab headlines often landed with the same public reaction, sympathy mixed with disbelief. Because once the public has been trained to expect relapse, it starts treating recovery like a temporary plot twist instead of a real process. And that's the tragedy of this part. The more often help becomes content, the harder it is to separate recovery from reputation. Here's what most people miss. The legal timeline is only half the fallout. The other half is what those headlines do to trust. Directors, producers, insurers, people who decide whether you get cast, don't just look at talent, they look at reliability. And repeated legal and rehab headlines create a new shadow around your name. The idea that schedules might break, productions might stall, investments might become unpredictable. So even when the court story cools down for a moment, the industry memory doesn't. And once that perception hardens, it becomes harder to recover professionally than it is to recover legally. By the end of Part 5, Lindsay isn't just living through consequences, she's living through a new identity manufactured by repetition. And that sets up Part 6, the part Hollywood rarely says out loud: how the industry quietly steps back when your name becomes a risk. At some point, the damage isn't just what the public thinks, it's what the industry decides behind closed doors. And for Lindsay Lohan, the fallout wasn't a dramatic blacklist announcement. It was something colder. A slow, quiet retreat. Fewer offers. Fewer high-profile roles. More hesitation from the people who control budgets, schedules, and insurance. Because Hollywood doesn't panic about scandal the way the internet does. Hollywood panics about risk. A set runs on time. A film needs consistency. Investors hate uncertainty. And once a celebrity becomes associated with legal headlines and rehab rumors, the question shifts from, is she talented? To, can we rely on her? That single shift can erase opportunities faster than any scandal ever could. The unreliable label is especially brutal because it's sticky. Even if someone shows up and does the work, the reputation still whispers in every meeting. People start using coded language: complicated, hard to manage, not worth the headache, we can't afford delays. It doesn't have to be fair to be effective, it just has to be believable enough that no one wants to bet their project on a comeback. And then there's the public narrative problem. If the press has trained audiences to watch Lindsay for disaster, casting her becomes a distraction. The film stops being about the story. It becomes the Lindsay Lohan situation. That makes studios nervous. It makes marketing harder. It makes everything feel like a gamble. So the decline isn't just about fewer roles. It's about a loss of trust. Trust from the industry, trust from audiences, trust from the machine that once amplified her. The spotlight that built her became the spotlight that boxed her in. And when that happens, a comeback becomes a different kind of fight. Not the fight to be famous again, but the fight to be taken seriously in a world that decided your past is the only thing worth clicking. Lindsay Lohan never completely disappeared. She shifted. Over the years, she re-entered the public eye through smaller projects, controlled appearances, and new chapter interviews that hinted at stability. There were moments that looked like a reset, a softer image, fewer chaotic headlines, a public attempt to move past the tabloid era. But the hardest part about her timeline is that the culture didn't reset with her. The internet remembers peaks and collapses more vividly than quiet rebuilding. And that's the final twist. For some celebrities, one big hit can rewrite the narrative. For Lindsay, the narrative became the brand, the fallen star. And that label kept hovering even when she tried to step into something calmer. Not because change wasn't possible, but because public memory is addictive. It prefers a storyline over a person. So when you think back to the hook, red carpet to courtroom, the real question isn't only what she did, it's what fame did to her at an age when most people are still figuring out who they are. And if the same machine made her, can it make another Lindsay tomorrow? Because the most dangerous part of Hollywood isn't the camera, it's what happens when the camera stops, and the story keeps rolling anyway.